Who's here just because they remember the show Mythbusters and like it and the title hooked you? Perfect. The hook of a title, it worked. Who's here never seen Mythbusters or even heard of it? No? Okay. It's for the olds, right? That's kind of just getting a feel for the audience, what y'all know about the show. It's what I've based the talk on. The talk is CentOS Mythbusters. My name is Carl George. I'm the EPEL team lead at Red Hat. I've got some contact info up there. It'll also be on the last slide if you want to grab it from there. The real Mythbusters, I mentioned it was a show on the Discovery Channel. It ran from like 2003 to 2018. The hosts were experienced special effects engineers, and they would take these urban legends and myths and then examine them, kind of give them the scientific treatment. What can I observe about this? What can we study about this? What do we know? What are the facts? And then they would rate each myth as busted, plausible, or confirmed. And CentOS has been getting a lot of myths going around about it, and I kind of wanted to do the same treatment to it. Take those one by one and just look through them and think about how does this stack up when we actually look at the facts and not just repeat things and regurgitate them. So let's look at some of these myths. The first one is CentOS is dead. I don't think I would be here giving a talk to you about CentOS if this were true, but much less staffing a CentOS booth here at the conference. But let's walk through it. This is the myth that I probably hear the most often. All over social media, in person at conferences. I've even had, not here at this event, but at conferences, had people walk up to me staffing the CentOS booth at a conference and say, CentOS, I thought y'all didn't exist anymore. I'm like,
are you a crisis?
Yeah, I'm here. I exist. So the booth's here. We've got the sign. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's still here. But it is unfortunately a narrative that has been pushed pretty hard by certain organizations. But let's look into it and see. And when you hear about an open source project, one of the first things I'll do to get kind of a pulse check about how it's working is just look at the website. It's not the end all be all, but it's something you can look to see, hey, this website looks like it's from 2004. This project's probably, pretty ancient. It's not a guarantee. Some projects just have really very simple, straightforward websites, for better or worse. But that is your presentation to the world for an open source project. This is the CentOS project, what it looks like now, or at least, last week when I took the screenshot. And it's highlighting the CentOS Stream distribution, the CentOS Hyperscale SIG, Special Interest Group, and also the CentOS Showcase, which was a virtual event we did earlier this month. So recent events, distribution some of the other links on here will actually take you to the release announcement for CentOS Stream 10 that just came out in December. So recent release, recent events, it looks very much like an alive project to me. I'll also note this design of the website. This is a new redesign that we launched with the last release in December. There was another design before this, and then there was another redesign. Redesign to that took place 2 or 3 years before that. So it's getting regular refreshes. Our design team looks at it and says, yeah, we want to make these improvements, improve the responsiveness, improve the artwork. So that is, to me, that is a good spot check of like, what's this project doing? What do they have going on? But let's look a little bit deeper than just the website, just the pretty face we put out to the world. I know this is hard to read. You don't need to read any specific text on here, but this is just the GitLab website. In 2021, we started doing most all of our development on GitLab. And changes to the CentOS distribution happen via pull requests, or as GitLab calls them, merge requests. But I'm sorry, GitLab, pull request is the established term. It came first. I'm still going to call it that, even when I don't mean to. But there's lots of activity here, but I know it's too small to read, so let's zoom in on those pull request numbers. Over the last 4 years, over 47,000 merged pull requests. That, by any measure, is not a dead project. Very much alive, very active. So I would say that is not just alive, but thriving. So let's call this myth busted and say it's done. CentOS is not dead. I know some of you might be thinking, well, that's CentOS Stream. That's a different project. CentOS was another thing. And that's actually our very next myth, that CentOS Stream is a different project. This one's really common also, but let's start off by defining the official terms, just so we're all on the same page. CentOS, unqualified by itself, is actually just the project. It always has been. The distribution from the project was previously called CentOS Linux. The distribution from the project is now called CentOS Stream. There's a lot of history in there, but just for terminology, those are what those terms mean. Officially, those two things, CentOS Linux and CentOS Stream, officially we call them two separate distros. My personal opinion is that those were really two variants of the same distribution. Same major version, built in a different way, and I'll get into how that happens in a future slide a little bit. The original implementation, they were actually in the same build system. At the time I was working on the CentOS release engineering team, I would literally build an update for CentOS Stream 8 and then release it in that distribution, and about 6 months later, take the same build and release it in the CentOS Linux distribution. It was the same exact artifacts for most of the packages, just released on a different schedule. CentOS Linux had minor versions, and if you kind of looked at how the updates happened over time, it would kind of look like a staircase. Very few changes, new minor version with a big jump, very few changes for 6 more months, and then another stair step. CentOS Stream just kind of smooths that out and releases things after they've passed QA, so it's one gradual increase through the major version and not the stair stepping. But the artifacts were the same at the time. Now that we've transitioned away from CentOS Linux, we actually have it. We're on a different instance of the build system, so it's not, that part's not true anymore. But the original implementation, the same build system, same artifacts, goes a long way, I think. Now, unofficially, outside of the official terms, a lot of people will just use CentOS as shorthand for the distribution from the CentOS project. That is a 100% true statement for CentOS Linux. And my personal opinion is that's still a true statement for CentOS Stream. There's other people that will disagree, but if you want to be pedantic and stick to official terms, let's say the full name every time with all those syllables for all that fun. But it's not just me pushing that idea. I'll see that in help requests. Someone will file a bug or ask a question on Mastodon or on Reddit or something, and I see people say like, "Hey, I'm running CentOS 10," and other people will say, "Well, I'm running Stream 10 or Stream 9," and there's no wrong answer here. There's the official names, and you can stick to those, or you can just use the shorthand. As far as the project itself, at the top levels, the CentOS project, I want to point out that it is the same maintainers. We have more maintainers now, which is another benefit that I'll talk about later. But it's the same people involved, the same project board, the same website, the same infrastructure. By every measure I can think of to look at this, it is the same project. People that want to claim it's different usually have some kind of agenda they're pushing about why they want you to believe it's a different thing. So I'm going to call that one busted as well. CentOS Stream is part of the same project as classic CentOS Linux. The next myth I want to talk about. I'll hear this one a lot. Well, CentOS Stream, it sounds neat, but it's too different. It's too different from CentOS Linux, or it's too different from RHEL, so I don't want to use it anymore. I'll hear this usually when people are really just trying to convince themselves that they don't want to use CentOS anymore and they want to justify it. But to explain, let's talk about this myth in depth and see how the distributions themselves are created. Any of y'all that have come by my booth today probably already got this spiel and saw these diagrams. But here's the old relationship for how these distributions were put together, this little Red Hat ecosystem here. Fedora Rawhide is the roll-in release. It's the leading point where new versions of software are integrated. And then Fedora releases a major version every 6 months. Each of those is fairly short-lived. It's maintained for about 13 months, just over a year. And every 3 years, there wasn't a set schedule at the time, but every couple of years, Red Hat would take a Fedora version and do private development on it to create the next major version of RHEL. They would have a major version branch that was just private development internal to Red Hat, and then they would release minor versions like RHEL 7.0, 7.1, and that's what the public people would see in the public, just the finalized, certified, minor version product that's released. The CentOS project started off by taking the source code for RHEL and rebuilding it, and would be downstream of RHEL to try and reproduce it as close as possible from those public sources. That kind of evolved into an idea of bug-for-bug compatibility. CentOS maintainers will tell you, even the long-term ones that were working on the project from the beginning will say that CentOS Linux was never bug-for-bug compatible. That was always just the goal to work towards. But there were always some changes that didn't quite work right. But the problem is with bug-for-bug compatibility, it's more of a hindrance than it is a helpful thing, because when you're in that setup, you can't make any changes because that would be a change diverging from what you're trying to match for compatibility. You can't make your own changes. You can't fix bugs yourself. And most importantly, you can't accept contributions from the community. CentOS is actually shorthand for Community Enterprise Operating System. And so how could the Community Enterprise Operating System literally not accept any contributions to that change the operating system? It doesn't make any sense. It did make a useful distribution in that you could literally use it and it would work really well, but it was flawed because of that lack of being able to contribute to it. I remember times where I would file bugs with CentOS, problems I'd identify, and even provide the fix and get the feedback that, oh, well, this makes sense, but this bug is also in RHEL, so if we fixed it, then we diverge from RHEL. So we're going to close this, and you can go talk to RHEL and go be a RHEL customer. Maybe they'll fix it then, and then we'll reproduce it. Another aspect of this is that you could contribute to Fedora to get changes into the next major version of RHEL years and years down the road, but it would be so far out that it would be frustrating if you're currently using one version of RHEL at your work or whatever for your use case. You can't contribute changes into that major version of RHEL. You have to wait until the next major version to even possibly have something considered. So here's the modern relationship and the way we've changed it up. Now the branching from Fedora takes place in the CentOS project. Like CentOS 10 just came from Fedora 40, and we did that all in public. We had a bootstrap phase, and then we released it just in December, as I mentioned. And now that is the major version branch that RHEL minor versions branch off from. So that is what just came out. RHEL 10.0 is very close to being released. Probably, you'll probably see it in the next couple of weeks, maybe next month or two. And that RHEL 10.0 is kind of the state of CentOS 10 a couple of months ago. CentOS has already moved on to start doing 10.1 content, so you can already look ahead to see what's coming 6 months down the road for RHEL 10. With this model, you can still contribute to Fedora to get changes in the next major version of RHEL, but now you can contribute to CentOS directly. We can accept pull requests there, and then those go into the next minor version of RHEL. So you're not having to wait years to get a contribution landed. You can get it landed in a couple of months. That's a much, much better model, in my opinion. Because CentOS is where RHEL is getting built in the public, what I like to say is that CentOS now defines enterprise Linux. Doing that, though, it has to follow the RHEL compatibility rules. If we did some kind of wild change that was breaking everyone in CentOS, that would mean that RHEL customers would have breaking changes going from, say, 9.5 to 9.6 or 10.0 to 10.1. And that's obviously not going to be okay. We have to keep it compatible and follow all of those RHEL compatibility rules for the major version. So, coming back around to what what the myth says, that it's too different. It is different. It's not that different. Claiming that it's a completely different thing would be like claiming that RHEL 9.5 and RHEL 9.6 are totally different things. No, they're minor version different. They're basically the same in a few changes, a few extra features, a few extra fixes. So, in that vein, I think that I can call this one busted. They're built differently in a good way, but they're not totally different. So, here's another good one. Who's heard this one? CentOS Stream is a rolling release. Yeah, a few people. I hear laughter. This one's a little bit of our own doing. We kind of screwed this one up. When we were first announcing CentOS Stream, it's actually, I say we, it predated my employment at Red Hat. So I was outside the project at the time, but what they were trying to do was to convey that it was rolling from one minor version to the next. When this got announced, the first thing I said was, I talked to my friends in the project and I said, that doesn't make sense. That's not a rolling release. That just means you don't have minor releases. And they were like, oh yeah, that's probably a better way to phrase it. But the announcement had already gone out. Eventually, it caused enough confusion that we just removed all of that mention of rolling release from the website, took it down and said, no, this confuses too many people. It doesn't really work that well. It's not a rolling release. It has major versions. Each major version has an end-of-life date. And that's the comparison I'm drawing here, is that a real rolling release, it doesn't have a version. You just install it. There's one update channel. There's not an end-of-life date. You just keep using it until the project falls apart or you switch to something else. CentOS Stream, it's got those major versions, end-of-life dates, and there's separate update channels for each major version. Unfortunately, even though we don't call it a roll and release anymore, there's a lot of people that still do. Some of our detractors have latched onto that term and just won't let it go. We've literally asked them, can you please stop calling it a roll and release because we made a mistake. We were wrong. We shouldn't have called it that. But still, we still see that term popping up, and it's just misleading and doesn't really work. On the CentOS website now, the term that the board has gone with is continuously delivered, which personally, I don't care for this term either. It doesn't really make sense for a distribution. It just means that it's a distribution that gets updates, which that's all distributions. It's a convoluted term, but they're still trying to convey that this doesn't have minor versions, and just trying to describe a negative, what you don't have is difficult. But given all that data, I think it's pretty clear. We can call this one busted as well. It is not a rolling release. Here's another myth that I hear sometimes. CentOS Stream is bleeding edge. This one is kind of an extension of the rolling release thing. True rolling releases do have very recent versions of software, often known as bleeding edge, because you'll get kind of new bugs and software that just came out, last week, last month, whatever. But this one is really easy to just measure scientifically. How recent is the software in CentOS Stream? Obviously not conclusive, but here's some of the most prominent things you'll see in a Linux distribution. And if we look at CentOS Stream 9, it's got Linux kernel 5.14, released in 2021. Systemd 252 from 2002, glibc 234 from 2021, GCC 11 from 21, bash 5.1 from 2020. I'm not sure about y'all, but 3 to 5 year old software is very much not bleeding edge in my opinion. And it's the same story with CentOS Stream 10. You'll see most of those versions of the same software were released in 2024, last year, which is a lot newer, but also that is the version we just released, and those are going to be pretty much the same versions for the rest of its 5.5 year life cycle. If you think back to our branching diagrams, that actually, the timing for that makes a lot of sense. CentOS Stream 9 branched from Fedora in 2021, and 10 branched from Fedora in 2024, around those time frames. So they kind of started with whatever was current in Fedora at the time. So that one, I hope not controversial at all, that it is not bleeding edge software. That one is just empirically false. There's no way around it. So we're going to call that one busted too. It is not bleeding edge software. So myth, CentOS is still an LTS. So I'll admit this one's a little bit contrived. I didn't want the entire talk to just be busted conclusions. I want to use one of the confirm signs. So this one's a little bit of an inverse of what I actually hear sometimes. Or I will say this, that it's still an LTS, and get people telling me, no, it's not an LTS anymore, and trying to correct me on it. First, let's look at the history of the term LTS to set the context. It stands for long-term support. The earliest mention I can find of it anywhere for Linux distributions, Ubuntu kind of pioneered the term in 2006 with their version 6.06 Dapper Drake. That was the first LTS version of Ubuntu that had a longer life cycle. And they pretty much defined it and set the standard as it's a distro with the major version life cycle of at least 5 years. It's been emulated by other distributions since then. Definitely a lot of Ubuntu derivatives. Debian eventually got on board and used the same nomenclature. In 2014, they released Debian 6 Squeeze and announced that it had, wasn't when Squeeze came out. That was when they announced the LTS program to extend Squeeze out to 5 years. CentOS Stream has a 5.5 year life cycle. The old CentOS Linux had a longer life cycle, 10 years, so it is a reduction from that, but it's still a long time, multiple years. And if 5 years and up is the established standard for LTS, then I'm sorry, 5.5 years is an LTS. So let's call that one confirmed. It is still an LTS. So myth, you can't use CentOS Stream in production. This one is fun. It actually originates with a statement on the Red Hat website. Mind you, Red Hat is a company that sells a product and would very much like for you to buy that product. I'm not here to sell you that product. I'm just telling you, making statements that should be obvious to anyone, that companies exist to sell their product. This statement on the website says, among other things, it leads into the part where it says that CentOS Stream is not designed for production use. This is a company that would like you to use RHEL in production because RHEL comes with promises, agreements, certifications, and services, all standardized for Red Hat Enterprise Linux. The only thing Red Hat recommends for production is RHEL with support. Notably, and this one's hilarious to me, if you go in the RHEL store right now and go buy self-support RHEL, it also says that RHEL is not intended for production environments. And it's the exact same bits. It's because Red Hat only recommends running RHEL with support in production. So anything that doesn't have support from Red Hat is not going to be endorsed or recommended for production use. Red Hat never endorsed CentOS Linux for production use. It definitely doesn't endorse Alma or Rocky or Oracle or Ubuntu or Debian or any of these other distributions. They endorse we think you should use RHEL in production with our support. Aside from Red Hat, a company who would very much prefer you to use RHEL, what are other companies doing? A flagship example we like to bring up because they allow us to talk about it is Meta. They're very active in the CentOS hyperscale SIG. And they are running CentOS Stream at massive scale in production. I remember when their slide decks used to say that they had about over 1 million servers, and then they got the marketing approval to change that terminology to millions plural. So in my mind, I'm guessing that means they probably went from 1.5 million to maybe 2 or 3 million. I don't know, maybe it's more than that. I'm guessing because they're limited in exact numbers they can say, but they are allowed to say, yes, we are running CentOS Stream in production at massive scale. I know that they're currently on CentOS Stream 9, and they've started their rollout for CentOS Stream 10, and they're hoping to have that all done and completed by the end of the year. I wish I had more companies I could name drop. I know of a lot more companies, but they've literally asked me, please don't use our company name in your presentation. Don't use me as a logo thing. So I won't name any other names, but I do know for a fact that there are companies using CentOS Stream in production in finance sector, energy, space exploration, education, just all the industries, if you can think of it. Some of these, there are people that used CentOS Linux before. They took a chance on CentOS Stream and said, yeah, this doesn't seem that different. And they were like, okay, well, yeah, we're using it in the first 5 years. The change from 10 years to 5.5 years doesn't really bother us. And we like getting this newer software and like Meta, getting onto the new versions as they come out, not waiting the maximum time possible on an older version. So any companies, I think, that have a good operational maturity to roll out updates like that and keep their fleet on current versions and do updates, it works pretty well for them. So I think that is enough data to call this one as busted. CentOS can and already is being used in production, even if Red Hat would rather you use RHEL. Another myth. CentOS Stream is untested. This one really bugs me just because the people that claim it, again, they're trying to convince themselves or maybe others that, oh, here's why you shouldn't use it. It's just they're getting you to test it for them. And that's just not going to be how things work. CentOS Stream is tested at multiple levels. If you're familiar with RPM packaging, there are checks that are run in the spec file during the build process for that package. Usually it's the upstream unit tests. We also have some integration tests that are on a per package basis. They live alongside the package source code. And when pull requests are sent to change those packages, what we call dist-git tests, those run at the same time. So there's a test in the package build, and then after the build's over, the dist-git tests also get run. Not all packages have those defined, but most of them do. And then once that build has completed and passed all of those checks, it can get composed into this. We call it a compose. It's a little bit more industry lingo, but it is basically the collection of all of the repos together and also the ISOs for installation. That compose also has to, I skipped a step. Before it's allowed into that compose, it also has to pass RHEL gating tests that are internal to Red Hat. There's additional tests. The dist-git tests are in the public. Anyone can contribute to those and add your own test cases to it. Then there's additional test cases, usually corresponding with some kind of specific customer scenario that are inside Red Hat, and the system's wired up together where if the internal private tests don't pass, the build can't advance in the pipeline either. So it's tested at that level as well. Once it passes all of those, we're up to three different levels of testing. Then it can get into the compose. The composes themselves get run through another level of testing. That's usually like package to package type functionality or things like that aren't limited to one specific package. So yeah, those composes get tested, and then once they pass those tests, then they can actually get pushed out to the CentOS string mirrors, and that's when the regular users would see them. So to say that the software is untested and it's just getting thrown to people to file bug reports for RHEL just doesn't make any sense at all. Like, it's tested heavily, and it only benefits Red Hat and RHEL and CentOS to publish tested artifacts that work and do what they're intended to do. Now, that's not to say that tests are perfect. It's absolutely possible that there's some scenario not being tested for that, an update rolls out, all the tests pass, but there's this other way it could be used that doesn't work correctly. That does happen from time to time, and usually the answer there is like, okay, we just defined another test case, and maybe you add that in the package check section, maybe you add it in the dist-git test or the compose level checks. Lots of options about how to go about making sure that same regression doesn't happen, at least in the same way. The good part is a lot of those tests are public, everything but those internal RHEL gating tests. They're out there in the public. If you have your own use case, a build got published, and you find that, yeah, my workload, it worked before on this build, but now it doesn't on this build, you can contribute that use case in that test and get it, and then get guarantees that, well, not really guarantees come with the product, but you get a lot more confidence that future updates are not going to break your use case because you help define what those tests are. So I think I've run that one through the ringer pretty far, just enough to say that it is busted. CentOS Stream definitely is tested. So here's where we're getting spicy. We got some good ones. So I hear this a lot. IBM forced the CentOS Stream changes. This one is, in my opinion, literally tinfoil hat territory. It is based on, there's no empirical evidence of this, and disproving it is a bit like having to prove a negative. I would much rather people making this claim offer some proof of it. They can't because it's not true. But I'll go ahead and take a stab at busting this myth anyways. Mainly just looking at the timeline of events. In January 2014, Red Hat hired the core CentOS maintainers. Before this, CentOS was kind of on the verge of collapsing. It wasn't in a very good state. This was important to keep the project going. It provided those maintainers salaries and infrastructure to the project. But there was zero incentive for Red Hat to grow the team at this point. It was just, we have some other projects that are developing against CentOS. We want the project to keep going. We don't want it to collapse, so we'll help it out. We'll hire these people. We hire people to work on open source all the time. This is what Red Hat does, so let's give these people jobs. But after that point, there was no incentive to grow the team and put more engineering resources, more people behind the project, because in a way it kind of competed with the RHEL product. There's no financial incentive for the company to grow that team and compete more with the RHEL product. They were fine to just say just enough to keep it going. But that in 2014, because of that dilemma, like, okay, we're doing this, but it's kind of a weird fit and kind of awkward, that's when the conversation started of how do we resolve this dilemma and make it not awkward and make, I hate the corporate term, but synergy between RHEL and CentOS. How do we make this work together in a way that benefits everyone? So that's the very start, 2014. 2016, 2017, that's whenever the conversations really started picking up about the contribution problem. I mentioned earlier how you couldn't really contribute to CentOS because it was trying to match RHEL one for one as close as possible. And that's really just not a healthy open source project, and especially a project with community in the name that you couldn't contribute to. It fundamentally bothered a lot of people, inside and outside of Red Hat, that this isn't really an open source project. This is just kind of a thing that exists that you can use. So this 2016 timeframe or so, this is whenever the conversations really started picking up. Like, okay, we've got this staffing dilemma, we've got the contribution dilemma. Like, what can we do to solve this? And this eventually led. This is when the plan started coming together about we could solve this if we just flip the relationship around. Instead of CentOS based on RHEL, let's base RHEL on CentOS, and then we can merge contributions into CentOS. RHEL maintainers would do their work in CentOS, and then it would land in RHEL. We'd increase the staffing, we'd increase the we'd enable contributions at all, and hopefully get those going strong. So that was kind of the rough idea, and when that started coming together. I was outside the company at this time, but I was involved in the CentOS project and talking to people, which is why kind of reading the tea leaves in some conversations, I knew that this was happening. And then later on, after I got inside the company, I found out, oh yeah, you remember that conversation you interrupted at this conference? We were actually talking about this already then. So I know for a fact it was already going on. And then a year after that or so, October 2018 is when IBM first announced intent to acquire Red Hat. So all just empirical evidence, all these things are happening way before IBM was even in the picture. July 2019 is about a little less than a year later is when the deal closed. And then September 2019 is when CentOS Stream was announced. So hopefully with that timeline, it's easy to see that, yeah, this is not something IBM did. And even without the background, the long history, I don't think there's anyone here that thinks that a company as large as IBM can implement a change this big in 3 months from July 2019 to September 2019. Like, that's just not realistic. So that one's busted. CentOS Stream changes were not driven by IBM. So here's another spicy one. This one's fun. And I'm not saying anything personal here. These are just the facts and the history around how things came together. Greg Kurtzer, founder of Rocky Linux, the myth is that he was the original CentOS founder. CentOS has a long and complicated history, but some aspects of this are pretty clear. I don't know how easily this is to read this text here, but this is an email from back in the early days of CentOS forming. And Greg did a great favor to the CentOS project as it was getting started. He had his own distribution called CentOS Linux, and he had a foundation for it. And when the CentOS was first getting off the ground, he graciously offered to help host it in his foundation, which was awesome of him. He helped participate in those conversations about how to structure it, and you could definitely make the case that he would be a co-founder or contributing founder, things like that, and that he was around at the time. But he didn't at the time consider himself the original founder, the founder. And for the next 16 years from that point, I can't find a single instance where he claimed that. That didn't really start until 2019. And I'm not necessarily connecting the dots here, but that was also the time when he was seeking venture capital funding for a startup. So maybe there's something around there around notoriety, but that is what it is. Because the quote, I didn't read the quote. He said that he was totally not interested in leading a total rebuild distribution. Happy to help get it started. Again, very gracious of him. It helped get the project started and provide that initial structure. But if you're totally not interested in something, it's a little weird, 16 years later to say, yeah, I founded this. It doesn't really work that way. So I'm going to call that one busted too. Not the founder. Co-founder maybe. Here's a bonus myth. This one actually isn't about CentOS at all, but it sort of is in a tangential way. This is a much older one. Some of the old folks in here probably remember it. Before Fedora, before RHEL, before CentOS, there was a distribution called Red Hat Linux. Not Enterprise Linux, just Red Hat Linux. Red Hat made this distribution. It was a product. You could download it for free. You get updates for free. You could go buy box sets in stores. And I kind of joked that the business model at the time was that the internet was so slow that people would pay to have a box set of it so they wouldn't have to download updates. Just very clearly, that is not going to be a sustainable business model over time. Red Hat eventually wanted to move into the subscription model where they sold a subscription product that you could use. That became RHEL. But the myth is that Red Hat took Red Hat Linux and decided to just split it in two and made fast-moving Fedora and then slow-moving RHEL that was a subscription product. And a lot of people looked at it as, you're taking the product away from me, or the product was free and now you're charging me for the product. But does that really stack up with history and facts? Or is that just how people vaguely remember things happening? What I like to point out for this is that RHEL 2.1 was based on RHL 7.2. They existed at the same time. And then RHEL 3 was based on RHL 9. Again, there's overlap there. Red Hat Enterprise Linux started as a separate thing based on Red Hat Linux. And then what happened with Red Hat Linux was it got deproductized. Basically, what was going to be Red Hat Linux 9, or sorry, Red Hat Linux 10 became Fedora Core 1. It was an effort to, similar to the CentOS Stream stuff, not being able to contribute to Red Hat Linux bothered a lot of people that felt strongly about open source inside Red Hat. So the idea was, let's deproductize this, push it out of the company, make it a community project, and we can get contributions to it. And that's what became Fedora Core. It was not an overnight thing, just like the CentOS Stream changes have not been an overnight thing. It takes time to build up a community, but that is where it started. And Red Hat Linux just kind of got debranded and turned into Fedora Core. Later, they dropped the core suffix. There's some other history there. A good talk, the Fedora project leader, Matthew Miller, he has a good talk on YouTube you can look up where he talks about the core extras merger. It's a very interesting history if you're into that part. But this is older than that. So, Red Hat Enterprise Linux and Red Hat Linux coexisted for a while. So I don't really see how you can say that that was a split into RHEL and Fedora whenever it happened this way. Oh, here's the part I was talking about. The RHL 10 beta, which was actually version 9.093, was the way they did the versions then. 10 got this high number towards the back. The code name for it was Severn. Fedora Core 1 beta, they updated it. If you look from here to here, they really just dropped the leading digit because it went from 9.0.93 to 0.94, and it was still codenamed Severn. This is why I tell people it really was just debranded Red Hat Linux, and it was still about the same life cycle, about 2 releases a year. Eventually, Fedora standardized on every 6 months coming out. But Red Hat Linux was roughly twice a year, not exactly 6 months interval. So it was a similar pace and just got a rebrand. This is at that then, but then Red Hat Linux after version 3, version 4 was based on Fedora Core 3, and it just changed from being based on Red Hat Linux to based on Fedora Core, and it just kept going after that. So just looking at those releases and how things were structured, I'm going to call that myth busted as well. Red Hat Linux did not split into Fedora and RHEL. Red Hat Linux got rebranded. So that is all the myths that I built into my slide deck today. I forgot to start my timer, so I don't know how much time I actually have left.
8 minutes.
Yeah, you got 8 minutes.
8 minutes of Q&A. So, what would you like to know?